Thank you very much, David, for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor and a great pleasure for me to be back with this organization, to reconnect with old friends, and hopefully after today make some really new ones as well. I'm also very excited and feel that it's a very refreshing morning to see so many of you here today and on Zoom as well. It's really delightful to see that. I'm reminded of what C.S. Lewis once remarked in the atomic age. He lived, of course, in the 40s and 50s and wrote prolifically as a university professor at Oxford. And he was commenting about the atom bomb and how a lot of people were living in fear. And he said that if the bomb is going to come to us, let it find us doing sensible and human things like reading, teaching, praying, taking care of the children, and interacting with friends, and not living in fear like sheep just because the scientists have added one more cause of premature death, or one more chance of premature death in a world where these chances bristled throughout, and also in a world where death is not a chance, but a certainty to which we were long sentenced before the atom bomb came into existence. So thank you for being here. Thank you for living your life despite the mandates and requirements of the governor and other elected officials who many times act hypocritically because in their personal lives they're caring about regardless of the pandemic. So great to be here, excited. One topic that I wanted to spend time on today is the budget, and specifically the most recently approved $1.9 trillion measure that came out of Congress earlier this week. It's ostensibly called the America Rescue Plan, or it's nominally called the America Rescue Plan, but it is anything but that. It's it has so many problems that I want to expose and talk about and properly contextualize for you guys so you can appreciate what is contained within that bill. But before I do that, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about my background so you can properly contextualize what I'm about to say on finance and economic issues, just so you have an appreciation for where I come from. As David mentioned, I'm a city council member right now in Cudahy, California, which is about 10 miles southeast of downtown Los Angeles, a very small city. I became a council member in 2013 following a severe corruption scandal, not too dissimilar from my neighboring city of Bell. Everybody remembers Bell.
Yes.
That was the city where the city manager was paying himself $1.5 million a year in a town where the average income is $30,000.
Oh,
I mean, a really disgusting violation of the public trust. And in my city, we had a very similar scandal. Council members were indicted for corruption and bribery, and it was just a very sad situation. I was recently relocated to the area from New York. I had moved into the family home thinking naively at the time that I would eventually move to the west side and somewhere along the beach cities and kind of live a private life. But when the scandal happened, I reflected on my city's situation and thought, gosh, you know, what a poor city that where not only are residents struggling, but the leaders don't even care about the residents. One of the city council members didn't even speak English. Nobody had a proper education or, in retrospect, you know, the proper ethical disposition. And so I said to myself, I'm going to find a good candidate to run. And so I looked and I looked, and at some point I had to be truthful to myself, look in the mirror and determine whether, you know, I was really the person at the right time for the moment to step up to the plate and run for city council. So I did. I ran, I won, and in 2013 I was appointed mayor by my freshly elected colleagues. And boy, it was like playing SimCity in real life. We got rid of the community services director, the finance director, the city manager, and we built a city from scratch. I mean, it was baptism through fire, and it was a remarkable learning experience as a young mayor with no previous government experience. And I ran as a responsible candidate, attending to issues that matter to my constituents. And although I did not brand them as Republican issues, they were absolutely conservative values, like balancing the budget, like controlling a code enforcement department that at that time was overreacting and treating private property owners very unfairly, or exorbitant fees across the board. And so I fought on those kinds of themes, or on controlling government, because we had an experience where government was so out of control that it was actually corrupting the finances and mismanaging the city's affairs. And so for me, the idea of challenging the state or serving as a check on the state was very, very real to me, and that was one of the themes I ran on, and it was a compelling set of propositions for my constituents. In subsequent races, I've now been reelected a couple of times. I've been attacked by the Democratic machine. Again, I don't ostensibly run as a Republican, but it's no secret. Everybody on the left attacks me for it. I've been called a Tea Party extremist, a Donald Trump fanatic, and in some cases it actually gets quite nasty. There was one flyer that was circulating that had a Nazi uniform superimposed on me, and all because I had attended President Trump's inauguration in Washington, D.C. I mean, that was a sufficient indictment to call me a Nazi. So to me, it was so over the top that my constituents saw through that right away, and I was elected with a lot of support from the community. I'm very, very excited about that. One of the things I did as well immediately after getting elected in 2013 was call for a forensic examination by the California State Controller. And that was a lot of work. I went to John Chung at the time, knocked on his door, figuratively and literally as well during one visit to Sacramento, and I was getting no response until I went to the Los Angeles Times and told them that I was demanding a forensic examination of my city. And after they published an article in the newspaper, I finally got a response from the controller, and sure enough, they came to my city and exposed a lot of the deficiencies that I had already uncovered through my own professional view of the matter. I'm a certified public accountant, as David mentioned, and so I use my professional skill set to dive deeply into the finances of my own city. And I handed a 10-page report to the state controller, and after they conducted their forensic examination, they basically validated everything that I had uncovered. So for me, it was validation of what I had been telling the people all along. So that's my quick story on the political front. But the story begins a lot earlier, of course. I was born and raised in the city of Cudahy to hardworking Mexican immigrant parents. My parents moved to Cudahy in the 70s. They were factory workers in neighboring Vernon. And at the time, it was mostly a white working class community, but over a generation, it has now become 98% Hispanic. And in terms of political affiliations, it's about 90% Democrat. I am the only Republican elected official at any level of government for my constituents, and I am the only Republican elected official in a 7-city radius. It used to be 5, now it's 7-city radius. So for better or worse, I am the face of the Republican Party in my region. That's for sure. I'm the face of the Republican Party. So I try to be a good steward of that brand and to carry myself honorably and honestly. I think I'm the only elected official in my region, and dare I say maybe even in the state, that has never accepted a single penny from any vendor, contractor, or business that has a relationship with my city. Not a single penny. So for me, that's very important.
Wow.
Absolutely no conflict of interest in my case. One other quick story before I jump into the key topic for today is my affiliation with the Republican Party. It goes back to the age of 8. I remember in school, some of you may have heard the story already, but I remember during the election cycle of Ronald Reagan versus Walter Mondale. Some of you are too young to remember that one, but back in the 80s, I was in 3rd grade, and my teacher appointed a speaker for Walter Mondale and a speaker for Ronald Reagan during a mock debate in the classroom. And so I got assigned Ronald Reagan providentially, and the speaker for Mondale spoke up first and said, "I support Walter Mondale because my family is poor." And I stood up and retorted, "I support Ronald Reagan because I don't want my family to be poor." And so for me, the party was always about upward mobility and economic opportunity. And that was really important to me, even as a young boy, as an 8-year-old boy. I may not have appreciated all of the policy nuances and the differences between the different political parties, but I knew that I wanted a better life for myself, a better life for my family, a quality education, and that raw ambition was more closely aligned with the values of the Republican Party. And not only that, but in the era of Ronald Reagan, there was a real sense of patriotism that I grew up in. And it really influenced me and my orientation thereafter. I was very proud to be an American as a young boy, and it was an exciting time to be in this country under President Reagan's leadership, certainly. And so that's my quick story. I went to Harvard and to Stanford. I studied economics, and also spent a year abroad. I studied at Oxford University as a junior at Stanford, and spent a year immersing myself in the history of economic thought. And I was introduced to the classical economists like Milton Friedman and Frederick von Hayek and Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And that also helped orient my philosophy on the free market and economic policies. And so that's kind of my formation, ideologically speaking, and that kind of brings me to today's topic, which is the stimulus bill. So everybody's heard about, well, the so-called America Rescue Plan bill, but it's really a spending spree of unprecedented proportion. A $1.9 trillion bill was just passed, approved by a partisan vote. Not a single Republican voted for that. And in the Senate, it was 50-50, and the president finally signed that legislation. It is ostensibly about the COVID situation, but understand that only 1% of that bill is directly related to COVID vaccination or anything related to the vaccine, which is the single best remediation for this pandemic, the vaccine. But only 1% of that monstrosity is directly related to that. If you look at more indirect healthcare appropriations that tangentially connect to COVID, I estimate that it's closer to maybe 3.5% if you bring in some of the other ancillary expenditures. But direct vaccinations, 1% of that monstrosity. On average, it comes out to about $6,000 new debt per resident of the United States, $6,000. And this is all on top of $4 trillion that were passed in so-called COVID relief last year in 2020. So we are now in unprecedented territory in terms of our debt, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But what I want to spend some time on is what's in this bill. What exactly is in this bill? So it's $1.9 trillion. This is roughly how it breaks out, and then I'm going to comment about some of the key components. The single largest component of this, about 420 billion dollars of it, or almost a fourth of the bill, relates to the $1,400 distribution that will go to a lot of Americans, those that are with income levels below the threshold, which is about $75,000 per individual. So that category of constituents will receive a $1,400 stimulus check, and that accounts for about a fourth of the bill. But again, take this into perspective. Individuals will receive a $1,400 check, but their share of the debt associated with this bill is $6,000. So somebody's not getting a good deal here in the end, if you factor in the new obligations that we all have to pay for. So that's one aspect of it. And I'm also reminded of the tactic that a lot of Democrats use, even in local communities, when they shower people or specific constituencies with handouts, welfare payments or whatever. It's almost like a way to entice popular support by way of giving somebody a handout. Yeah. That's the classic recipe for welfare as well. Democrats will sometimes come into underprivileged communities that require economic development, and instead of focusing on things that really matter, like quality education for children, economic relief through lower business taxes, and other incentives for development, instead what a lot of Democrats will do is throw welfare payments and checks and handouts, and it's kind of a way of buying support from the people. Here's a little token handout, but I need your support, I need your vote, and then behind the scene, the Democrats really go out wild and begin to spend money, on things that they don't actively promote. It's like behind the scene is where they really do their dirty work, and in front of the scene is where they do the handouts so they can curry favor and achieve votes. It's a classic recipe, and I can see that on display with this bill as well. $1,400 here, give us the popular support, but behind the scene, $6,000 per resident is being spent on a variety of things that cover handouts for every imaginable constituency out there. I mean, there's money for airlines, there's money for Amtrak, there's an expansion of Medicaid for prisoners, there's about $10 billion in foreign aid that has absolutely nothing to do with COVID, and certainly nothing to do with domestic stimulus, and just a variety of handouts that I'll kind of give some examples of in a moment. So the key, one of the more significant components is this $1,400 handout. Okay, the next the most significant component is a payment to state and local governments, and this amounts to about $350 billion, or roughly 20% of the stimulus bill, or of this spending spree bill, is payments to state and local governments. And this is very, very problematic, because the original purpose of this handout was to help states recover from COVID-related shortfall in revenue intake. But that's very misleading, because in most cases, the shortfall is a lot lower than people originally projected. And that's really more a testament to the resilience of the private sector. So it's, in spite of government mandates, the private sector has managed to stay afloat, and revenues are coming in at a pace that is far exceeding what was originally envisioned at the outbreak of COVID. And so the point is that a lot of states and local municipalities don't really need assistance with the shortfall, because it's a lot lower than originally projected. But what the government is giving the states is a lot more generous. And there are problems with that. Number one, it's not perfectly related to the COVID shortfall. And number two, it's perpetuating irresponsible behavior that the shortfall would have corrected in a lot of ways. I mean, even in Los Angeles City, Mayor Garcetti, as recently as a few months ago, was negotiating with the labor unions, trimming fat where it was appropriate to trim. I mean, he was starting to act a little more disciplined. And I thought, gosh, at least one silver lining from all of this at the local level was that some of the mayors and council members were going to start acting a little more responsibly. But alas, with this bailout, now the elected officials are going back to their old ways, and it means that we're not really going to see any substantial reform. In California, we stand as a state, or the legislature stands to spend an additional, it's about $30 billion or so that they're getting, just $32 billion exactly to spend. And just this week, the legislature was commenting about how this money is going to go to the most vulnerable. Be careful when politicians say that they're going to spend money on the most vulnerable, because the reality is that they're going to go on a shopping spree and a spending spree that's completely out of control. But they're already salivating, they're foaming at the mouth, they're excited. Even Garcetti was totally excited to bits, and was talking about how the draconian cuts were not going to be made in light of this relief. So that's another component. About 20% of the bill is direct money to state and local governments so that they can perpetuate the mismanagement and the conduct that they had pre-COVID. Another broad component I would categorize as related to children, either K through 12 education, childcare, and something very, very problematic, which is this new child tax credit. So on a combined basis, all of these children-related thematic appropriations account for maybe 17% of the bill, or something like around $310 billion, and half of that is this tax credit for children. So the bill now outlines a $300 check that will go to every parent of a child per child. It's a little bit lower if the child is over the age of 6, but it's basically a very generous handout that doesn't even phase out until a very high income threshold. I think it's something like $580,000 per family. So pretty much if you have a child, you're going to get money from the government. So we're now paying people, of course, to have children. I mean, I wonder about the incentive structure that creates in certain categories of society. But now everybody's going to get money for having a child. And it's a one-year program, so it phases out after 1 year. But I ask you this, do you think that a Congress that is dominated by the Democrats, or not dominated, but that is held in majority by the Democrats, with a Democratic president 1 year before an election, is going to let that tax credit subside? Absolutely not. They're going to make a play for extending that tax credit, or worse, etching it permanently into the tax code so that it is a permanent tax credit. And this is not a tax deduction. This is a tax credit, which means that regardless of how much tax you owe, you're going to have this this payment as a result of having children. And what they're contemplating now is actually dividing that up into 12 payments. So every month, you're going to get a $300 payment. So for the year, it comes out to $3,600 per child, a little bit lower if it's an older child, but on a monthly basis, it'll be a $300 payment. It's kind of the closest thing we've come to so far of a universal basic income standard that, before it was unheard of, right? We're going to have, a minimum income guaranteed to every family. That's kind of an element of socialism that was unimaginable years ago, and now we're kind of encroaching into that territory through the tax code. Now, again, ostensibly for 1 year, but ask yourself if the Democratic majority in Congress is going to be satisfied with letting this sunset. I don't think so. Another broad category has to do with unemployment extension of benefits. This is maybe about 13% of the appropriation, or about $250 billion. So this is extending by $300 the weekly subsidization for unemployment benefits. And the problem with this is that in some cases, it will now pay more for workers to stay home than to go back to work. And this is a terrible disservice both to the worker as well as to the local economies where the workers are supposed to be producing. And so every major study out there shows that if you are out of the workforce for an extended period of time, you forego earnings potential for the long term, you forego professional development and skill set development. And so it's a terrible, terrible situation for the worker. And again, a terrible situation for the local economies that depend on that labor. So a terrible, terrible situation, but it's extended for another year. But again, I ask yourself, in a Democratic Congress with a Democratic president, 1 year before an election, do you really believe that they're going to let that phase out? And so those are together on combined basis, those four kind of broad areas: the child appropriations, the $1,400 stimulus payment to taxpayers, the money for state and local governments, and the unemployment benefits extension. Altogether, that accounts for about 2/3 of the bill. The remaining third is just a hodgepodge of handouts to every imaginable constituency. There's money, again, for airlines, for restaurants, there's money for foreign aid, just everything you can think about under the sun. I'm reminded of that movie, Goodfellas. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie where Henry Hill is on a date with his girl, and he's entering the Copacabana, and as he's going through the establishment, he's handing out everybody, a $20 tip, a $100 tip, and kind of working his way to the front of the restaurant. And it's kind of like his way of keeping everybody in his orbit, and paying everybody off so he can keep perpetuating his lifestyle. And I'm reminded of that with this stimulus bill. It's kind of a way for the Democrats to just pay off everybody in their orbit as a big thank you for the support, and then just to continue to have them as natural constituencies going into the next election cycle. So it's a handout, it's a giveaway, and so many people are getting paid off as a result of this. A couple of other examples of this, this category of handouts. One is for unions in a multi-employer pension program. So we've all heard about the public pension unfunded liability. I talk about it all the time. It's a serious matter, but very few people talk about the private sector pension programs, probably because taxpayers are not nearly on the hook to the same extent that they are with the public sector pension programs. But nevertheless, there are also corporations that mismanage their pension funds. They make bad investments, they make promises that are not sustainable, and so they also have to deal with a lot of problems with their management of the pensions. There is a pension guarantee board that's funded by the government, but it also receives contributions from all corporations to kind of keep that afloat. Well, in this bill, about $60 billion is going to be used to bail out these private sector pension plans. And so that's another kind of giveaway to selected unions, that have been very supportive of the Democratic Party. Another example of a giveaway in this bill is the Obamacare subsidies. You'll recall that when Obamacare was introduced, the premiums were so out of control They were increasing at alarming rates. And so to try to entice people into participation, the Obama administration basically gave everybody, or a lot of people, subsidies so that they can pay into the system. And there were income thresholds around that. I think it was 400% of the poverty level. Anyway, it was an income threshold that allowed a lot of people to get subsidies for Obamacare. And so what this bill does is it extends the income thresholds and grants even more subsidies so that more people can participate in Obamacare and keep that program afloat. So those are just some examples of the things on here. Again, there's stuff for the arts, there's stuff for prisoners. I mean, things that really have nothing to do with COVID. On the whole, only about 1% of the bill relates directly to vaccines, and only about 3%, by my estimation, relates broadly to COVID, to direct COVID remediation. Now, what are some of the risks of this mismanagement, of this largesse? What are some of the risks? I want to highlight a few points for your consideration. Number one, some of these individual components have not seen the end of the tunnel, or the end of the line. I mentioned earlier that in the case of the child tax credit, we can certainly expect that the Democratic members of Congress and the president will vote and make a case for extending these credits indefinitely, permanently, or at least for another year. So watch out for that. But that's not the only example of that. I think we're going to see a lot of examples where elements of this $1.9 trillion will be resurrected and promoted for extensions beyond the current horizon. So 1.9 trillion is really compounded and is really a lot more than the 1.9 trillion. Another concern that I have is that the bar has now been reset for what kinds of money we're going to spend on emergency matters. So things like, I'm reminded of like the Patriot Act in 2001. We declared ourselves, in a state of emergency, and it was an opportunity for the federal government to curry a lot of public support and ram through programs that were pre-existing before 9/11 even came into the picture, so that they could take advantage of the emergency situation to ram through extra government programs. The same thing happened during Obama years when we had the financial crisis. There was a huge stimulus bill. It was about $800 billion, and at the time that amount was unprecedented. $800 billion. This is out of control. But it was done under the auspices of emergency, an emergency declaration. And so now we're at $1.9 trillion, and that's the new bar. We have now breached a new frontier for spending levels when we get into emergency situations. And the concern that I have is that that bar has been reset. And so now the next time we have an emergency, it's going to be another $2 trillion, or the next one will be $3 trillion, and it's just becoming the new normal. And I think that there's a lot of risk of us accepting this as the new normal, especially under the auspices of an emergency. Even in my own city council, when the pandemic broke out last year, the mayor rushed to declare the city an emergency status and wanted to create a shadow city council comprised of the mayor, an appointee of the mayor, and the city manager, where they would have carte blanche to spend whatever money they thought necessary without any approval from the city council, all under the auspices of emergency spending for the pandemic. So be very, very careful when people or government invokes emergency status to try to get additional powers, additional authorities, additional spending opportunities. In California, the legislature last year gave the governor carte blanche as well under COVID emergency situation to just spend money however he saw fit. No approval needed from the legislature. They gave him a very, very generous appropriation that he could spend however he wants. So be very careful when people talk about emergency declarations. And I just fear that we're kind of raising the bar. I'm reminded of the 4-minute mile in the Olympics. There was a time decades ago where that was unthinkable. It would never happen. The human body is not equipped for that. And then as soon as it was broken, it was the new normal. Now to make it into the Olympic trials, you kind of need to be hovering around that level of speed. And so it's just the new normal. And I think we've now ratcheted up the new normal for these bailouts and spending sprees under the auspices of emergency. Another concern that I have is the obvious one, that our debt is now getting severely out of control. We're now at $28 trillion, and that's what's on the balance sheet. There are things off the balance sheet, of course, things like unfunded obligations on retirement, the state and local government debt, unfunded obligations on Social Security, unfunded obligations on Medicare. All of these promises that are ostensibly off the books, also contribute to debt and obligations. And when we factor those in, we get to a level that's closer to $100 trillion. But going back to the $28 trillion, that represents about 130% of GDP. It is the highest level that we've experienced since World War II in terms of the ratio to gross domestic product. But in raw dollars, it is the highest amount of debt we have had since the history of the Republic, $28 trillion. As a share of our annual budget, interest on the debt is about 15%, which as a result of this week's stimulus this week's spending spree bill will amount to another extra percentage points going into the next fiscal year. And I think we're at risk of over time in the near term encroaching on greater and greater appropriations in other levels of the budget, because we're going to have to pay more and more interest. So very, very difficult situation for us going forward. And we are basically giving our children and our children's children a lot of debt that they will be responsible for going forward. Another kind of final risk that I want to share with you that the media doesn't really talk about, because maybe it's complicated, maybe it's a little too technical, or maybe it's a boring concept. I'm not exactly sure why the media doesn't talk about this, but it's what I call the inflation tax, because this is what's happening. Last year we had about $4 trillion of so-called COVID relief that was approved by the Congress. And the Federal Reserve Board, which is a completely separate entity from Congress, under the Constitution, they are completely separate and independent of each other. Okay, there's fiscal policy by the Congress, and then there's monetary policy by the Federal Reserve. But this is what we were observing last year, almost lockstep as Congress was spending money. We were observing that the Federal Reserve was purchasing the Treasury bonds. In March alone of 2020, they purchased $500 billion in one shot of Treasury bonds. And over the course of the year, it was almost about $2.75 trillion of Treasury bonds were purchased by the Federal Reserve. What does that mean? It means at the end of the day, and they're purchasing it from individuals, from corporations, from other governments, from other agencies. So the Federal Reserve Board, doesn't have to pick up the Treasury bonds right away from Congress, or when the United States Department of the Treasury issues them. It can buy them in the open market as well. And so think about what that means. At the end of the day, if you get rid of the intermediaries and you get to the bottom line, which is that the Fed is basically printing money to pay for this largesse, what you're going to have is a classic situation where the money supply begins to outpace the growth of the economy. And that is the recipe for inflation. And we're now at unprecedented levels. We've not had this level of overspending by Congress in our history. $4 trillion last year and $2 trillion just this week. And the Federal Reserve is kind of almost in lockstep financing this kind of debt. And when they do that temporarily, they call it quantitative easing. That's a term that you've probably heard, quantitative easing. But there's no indication that I've observed of the Federal Reserve putting these back out into the private sector. And so there is a lot of subsidization happening by the Federal Reserve. And here's another interesting development as a side note. Does anybody know who the Secretary of the Treasury is now, appointed by Joe Biden? It's a lady named Janet Yellen. And Janet Yellen was the chair of the Federal Reserve Board, just before she was appointed to become Secretary of the Treasury. So there's a lot of cross-pollination between the Department of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. So yes, they're independent, but given the cross-pollination and the leadership, changing of the musical chairs, you can believe that there's at least some coordination under the table, even if not overtly. But there's a sense of what the other is doing, And when you see the lockstep purchasing of treasury bonds by the Federal Reserve at amounts that follow the overspending by Congress, you can see that what at the end of the day, what we're realizing is an overspending funded by increase in the money supply. So there's a risk of inflation that's around the corner. So those are some of the general risks that I wanted to expose. And so at this point, I think what I'll do is pause for any general questions. And my life as a public figure is an open book, so everything is available to be asked, and either in in my political career or in the topic at hand on finance and economics.
Let me just see if anybody.
Greetings everybody online as well.
Anybody have any questions?